The gospel reading is Luke chapter 4, beginning with the 31st verse. And Jesus went down to Capernaum, and they were astonished at his teaching, for his word was the authority. And in the synagogue there was a man who had the spirit of an unclean demon, and he cried out with a loud voice, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." But Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be silent and come out of him." And the demon came out of him, having done him no harm. And they were all amazed and said to one another, "What is this word? For with authority and power he commands the unclean spirits, and they come out." And reports of him went out into every place in the surrounding region. And he arose and left the synagogue and entered Simon's house. Now Simon's mother-in-law was ill with a high fever, and they brought him for her. And he stood over her and rebuked the fever, and it left her. And immediately she rose and served them. Now when the sun was setting, all those who had any that were sick with various diseases brought them to him. And he laid his hands on every one of them and healed them. And when it was day, he departed and went into a lonely place. And the people sought him and came to him and would have kept him from leaving them. But he said to them, "I must preach the good news of the kingdom of God to the other cities also, for I was sent for this purpose." This is the word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God. Jesus healed. And it's hard to know, what does all that mean? How do we make sense of that? The bar must have been very low. One of the things that we know from history, I read somewhere that doctors did more harm than good until about the year 1930 with the discovery of antibiotics. That's interesting, isn't it? So you had doctors, and they had leeches and bleedings and potions and salt. It's just hard to think about. Jesus did better than that. Jesus healed. And he seemed to have a special knack for healing people who were possessed with unclean demons. What is that about? I've seen people, maybe you have as well, suffering from sepsis, some toxicity in their system. They become delirious, and they look like they're somebody who is possessed. I have a good friend right now in Greensboro. His wife is suffering a terrible dementia that makes her just so erratic and combative and just crazed. He said to me the other day, I think I know now what Jesus saw in people that they thought were possessed by demons. And we did a series in our church on mental health a few years back, and one of the things we said then is churches tend to be pretty good if somebody has cancer, like we have prayer chains, and we bake casseroles, but then if somebody's postpartum depression or some psychosis, church people don't know what to do. Church people are supposed to know what to do. We're supposed to be good at this. What Jesus was up to with these healings and with what's wrong down here, I think all of this was exposed pretty clearly. Week before last, I was out of the country, so I missed it, so I did everything on replay. While I was out of the country, we had the inauguration. My two favorite inaugurations, this is bipartisan, my two favorite inaugurations, they will not be topped in my lifetime. I don't have the expectation of that. One is when John Kennedy was inaugurated, his great speech, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." We will never hear these words from a politician again, although if I do hear them, I will vote for that person. And then Abraham Lincoln, of course, his second inaugural, came along at a time of the most bitter division ever in this country. He did not say, "We won and you guys lost." Instead, what Lincoln said is, "With malice toward none, with charity for all, let us strive to bind up the nation's wounds." Do you hear those hopeful words? With malice toward none, charity for all. So I missed the inauguration, and when I got back, I heard that somebody the next day preached a sermon that touched off a frenzy. Everybody was upset about a sermon, and I thought, good. What we preachers don't want to happen is, "Hey, preacher, Oh, everybody yawns. Remind me of the story that there was the preacher who dreamed that he was preaching, and when he woke up, he was. Paul preaches in the book of Acts, as we'll see, and there are riots in the streets. It's amazing. John Wesley preached in the United Kingdom. Riots were touched off in the street. So this sermon really upset everybody. So somebody sent me a link. I thought, man, I need to check this out, right? People are asking me about it. So I was watching the replay, and immediately I had this fond memory because the service in question took place at the National Cathedral in Washington. Now, I got to preach there. I didn't look up the date. It was about a decade ago. And it was the most fun. And the most fun part of it was this. Lisa and I drive up and park the car, and there's a guy waiting for me in the parking lot. He's got a robe. He's holding this staff. He is, if you know your high church stuff, he is the Verger. He gets me out of the car. He leads me into the church. We find our way toward where I'm going to rest and robe until the service. And we're sitting there, and I said, sir, I need to go to the bathroom. He said, I will take you. He led me to the bathroom. I thought he was going in there with me. He waited at the door, but when I was finished, I came out. He led me back where we were. Service began. He led me down the aisle. He led me all the way to my seat. It was great. It was time for me to preach. Where I was sitting was about 7 feet from the pulpit, but he's there to lead me to the pulpit. I preached. I forgot about him. I turned around. There he was. Led me back to my seat. Service was over. Ushered us out to the car. Like, I love this. I don't get this treatment here. I pull up and it's like, it's fine. The Verger. So then I thought, I saw the Verger on the replay. It was great. And then I watched a little bit of the sermon. It just struck me as garden variety Christianity. Nothing radical, nothing to get all that upset about. The preacher did talk about mercy. And we just said, this is a bipartisan thing, friends. Mercy has evaporated from the landscape of our culture. It's just not a thing anymore. Nobody values mercy. If you see mercy, that's read as a sign of weakness. And we just can't have weakness, can we? We have to be strong. We can't have mercy. And then there were some fair replies, I think, I guess people thought there was too much mercy in the sermon. And they said, if we talk about mercy all the time, then there's no accountability. I mean, if we just talk about mercy all the time, then anything goes and we can't have that. Well, that's a fair enough point. So I tried in my mind, in light of this, to think when Jesus healed everybody, what was he up to? What was he up to? Lincoln's second inaugural, he pointed out we have two warring sides. Both read the same Bible. Both pray to the same God. The prayers of both could not be answered. The Almighty has his own purposes. What are Jesus' own purposes? Here are a few things. Jesus, to my knowledge, never argued that the Roman government should supply services for the poor. This is kind of interesting. I never really thought about this, but Jesus never said, you Romans, you better provide programs for the, he never said that. That's interesting. In fact, the Romans didn't pay any attention whatsoever to the poor, and they did not even speak of them until the Christians came along. There's a scholar of the early church named Peter Brown, and I love his phrase. He said, the Christians invented the poor. What he means by that is that nobody paid any attention until the Christians came and started talking about the poor as they grew, that you should do something about. And the Roman reaction to this was like, fine. Do something for the poor if you want. In fact, that'd be great for us. It would get the riffraff off the street, and we would enjoy our lives all the more. We wouldn't have to see those just poor, pitiful people that show up and beg. So please take care of the poor. If you take a course, if you remember college, the ancient Roman world was a shame and honor culture. Everything was about trying to have honor and avoid shame. And the people who were shamed were the people that were poor or suffering in some way that was just shameful. And the honored people were those that had wealth and positions and power. And you could actually be a person of position and power, but still accrue some shame. Maybe you make a boo-boo. Maybe you lose a war. Maybe you get an illness. And then there's shame. And you try to get past the shame. So everything is about shame and honor. Jesus came to banish shame. Jesus came to honor everybody. I think Jesus especially hated it that the most shamed people were those who were possessed by demons, right? And I think Jesus hated that. And I think what Jesus hated about it is, here's somebody who's already suffering so much, but then people don't know what to make of it, and they say, this person must be possessed by a demon. Do you see how that's like piling shame on top of shame? And Jesus will not have shame for anybody. For Jesus, everyone is to be honored. This applies at the personal level. 2 weeks ago, Taylor Pride Barefoot preached a wonderful sermon here. And one of the things she talked about, she didn't put it this way, but I will. You guys get dressed and you come to church and you look good. And if somebody asks you, you're doing fine. But I know some of you, when you're at home, you look in the mirror and maybe you avert your gaze a little. And you feel some shame over something you did, something inside you. You just feel ashamed. Taylor, in her sermon, said that with Jesus, there's no room for shame. Jesus says, do your spiritual work, but don't dive down into shame. God does not desire shame. She quoted Brene Brown, who said that shame works like a petri dish. And in that petri dish, it's all about secrecy and silence and judgment. And Jesus isn't about secrecy or silence or judgment. He wants to honor everybody. Jesus came to those that they're possessed by a demon, and Jesus touched them and healed them and honored them. They were as valuable to him as the Roman emperor or anybody else. It's a beautiful thing. One of the things that we know, by the way, is you can have mercy on the poor and shame them in the process. This happens all the time. Oh, we've got to do good for the poor, but when we do it in a way it just heaps more shame on them. And Jesus hates this. Jesus hates this. Jesus wanted to honor everybody. I'm sending out these bi-weekly emails on the Gospel of Luke. We're reading through Luke together. Hope you got my emails. If you don't, you can subscribe. I was working on one the other day that'll come out in a week or two, about a pretty cool story in Luke chapter 7. Jesus is there in Capernaum, and people come to him and they say, there's this centurion, he's a very important person, and he has a slave that he values highly who is critically ill and near death. And I love the way they put it. They said, you should come and heal this slave because this is an important man. He built our synagogue for us. You see how that works? Like, we're always looking for privilege and who should get things. I know somebody, he's a guy, he gets extraordinary medical care, and he was talking about it one time. He said, given all I have done in my life, I deserve the very best medical care. Do you hear that? Christmas Eve here, a couple of years ago. This is so interesting. If you don't know this, on Christmas Eve, people are scrambling for seats like crazy. And one of the points of controversy is some people save seats. Some people think that's great, and other people think that's the most wicked thing. And we're having all this tension. It's Christmas Eve. I was watching, and there was a guy, he'd come in, he had thrown coats over a pew, and it's about time for the service to begin, and nobody can sit, and people are in a mood. And the guy in front of him said something to him about it, said, I just don't think you should save seats. And I heard this guy say, I've been in this church a long time. I deserve this pew. Do you see how we do this? Deserving and worth. Jesus, because if there are people who deserve things, they're the honored ones, and those who don't have it, they're shamed just in the process of that, right? But Jesus doesn't want anybody to be shamed. Jesus wants everybody to be honored. Jesus actually heals the guy for the centurion, but it's because the centurion doesn't come up and say, I deserve for you to come. Instead, the centurion says, I'm not worthy. I am not worthy. Jesus is impressed. He says, you are worthy, and everybody's worthy, including your slave and the people that are nobodies. And he goes straight out, and he heals the only son of the poorest widow woman in town. That's Jesus. And it's why the text can say Jesus healed everybody, because Jesus wants everybody to live in a world where no one is shamed and everyone is honored. This is a clue for what we're supposed to be about as a church. God asks us, this is not Democrat or Republican. This is not liberal or conservative. This is garden variety Christianity. It is what God asks of us. God asks us to be part of a new world where no one is shamed and everyone is honored. Where no one is shamed and everyone is honored. I'll tell you a few stories to illustrate this. Pat Conroy, great novelist, came to Charlotte a few years back. Lisa worked it out where I got to go to a little private reception with him. It was great. I love Pat Conroy. He gave a talk later that night, I think it was in Ovens, and he told about his mother in her dying days coming to his home to live with him. And she got in the shower one night and collapsed and couldn't get up or out. So Pat had to climb in the shower with her, and he lifted up his mother. And just as he got her up, she turned her head to him and said, "Pat, I am so ashamed. I am so sorry to be a burden to you." And Pat said, "Mom, do not be ashamed. It's not a burden, it's a privilege." See how that works? Somebody's shamed, but we honor. Someone is shamed, but we honor. I was a pastor of a church here in Charlotte back in the 80s, way out on the plaza, and I did a funeral for one of their great people yesterday. That was a privilege to get to do that. When I was there, our church had this daily feeding program that people signed up for through the county, and they all came. They had a great time, meals. It was good. And but there was a guy, he was homeless, a street person, and he would show up every 2 or 3 days hungry. And Barbara, who ran the program, she thought nobody should be hungry. So this is so funny. He'd come to the door and she would say, "I'll meet you out back in a minute." And I would watch this happen because from my office I could see out back. So he would go around and he would sit on the stoop in the thick of where all the garbage cans and dumpsters were, and she would come out with a paper plate. Everybody else was eating on hard plastic plates. Paper plate, kind of sagging a little, and she would hand it to him and say, "You just eat this right here." She was feeding a hungry person. This is a good thing, right? But I watched that for a while, and it just got on my nerves. So I called Barbara and I said, "Next time he comes in, you call me, and I'll come down there, and I want you to take 2 plates, not paper plates, but the hard plastic plates like everybody else has, and fix us a lunch." I went down there. She had the 2 plates ready. I said to this guy, "Come with me." And we went to my office, and we ate lunch. Don't think, "Oh, James, he's so heroic. I got a free meal out of this thing." I mean, but it's just a little thing. Just saying, how can we honor and how can we get rid of the shame? Here's another thing. I have a friend who is a pastor, and he has a guy in his church who thinks God appointed him to give the pastor a hard time. There's like one in every church, none of you, and don't think I need to take up the mantle of this. Anyway, my friend, this guy, he's just mean. He's just mean. He looks for every opportunity to put his finger in his face and chew him out about something or another. And it's just so hard. And so my friend, who's a pastor, he feels so ashamed, but then he looks at the other guy and he shames him in response, like in his own mind. Like, he's a terrible person. How can he think he's a Christian? He probably shouldn't even come to church. You see what goes on there? They got this going on. And what do you do about it? He would try to run and hide, avoid the guy. Finally, we have a mutual friend who gave him some very good advice. He said, when you look at this guy, he said, you're thinking about it all wrong. He's not somebody to avoid, to be afraid of. He said, this is somebody, when you look at him, you need to think, man, that must be really hard for him to live inside his own skin. Think about that. You're just eaten up all the time with anger, and you have to express it. You can't help yourself. What's it like to live inside his skin? This changed everything for my pastor friend. He looks at this man now, and he says quite genuinely, he loves him. He loves him. That cuts the shame from him, and it keeps him from shaming the other guy. This happens at so many levels. What does Jesus want from us? I have a cousin, known her all my life, love her dearly. She's a huge advocate of Donald Trump, and you would think right now she'd be just happy as a lark, right? Because Trump won the election, and what she wished for the last 4 years has come true. But lo and behold, she's not happy. She's not happy. She's still very angry. She is very bitter. Half the people that she passes in a day, she loathes them and thinks that they're so bad and so deluded. She's just still eaten up with this thing. Be very clear, if the election had turned out differently, the other half people would be strutting around, the other half would be miserable and exasperated. Lincoln spoke of malice toward none, charity for all. None are to be shamed. All are to be honored. I'll close with this story I've told you before, but it bears repeating. There's a woman who lives here in Charlotte, lives out near Johnson C. Smith. Her name is Dorothy Count Scoggins. Dot became famous in 1957 because she was the first black kid that they sent into an all-white school system here in Charlotte, North Carolina. Why in the world did they send one solo black kid into this white world? Oh, my goodness. And what you have to know about that time, this is important to think about from perspective. In those days, the vast majority of white Charlotteans thought the government was enacting something that would be the ruin of America. Isn't that interesting? How that can happen. The vast majority of white Charlotteans thought this was something integrating the schools. This would be the ruin of America, and they hated the idea. So Dot showed up for school the first day, and there were, of course, press reporters there, and the photos went viral all over the world. And you may have seen the photo. Dot's coming in, and the people behind her, they're making faces, and they're spitting at her, and they're throwing rocks at her. Just ugliness. They were shaming her. They didn't get the memo. Some of them were churchgoers, I'm sure. They didn't get the memo that you don't shame anybody when you're a follower of Jesus. Those photos went viral, and one of them made the newspaper in Paris, France, where there was a man named James Baldwin. Baldwin was a great essayist and novelist, social commentator. He was black. He was so sick of racism in America, he got out of here. He went to Paris. And when he got to Paris, nobody thought badly of him because he was black. He was cool. He was a chic party goer. I mean, he loved being in, it's Paris, after all. I mean, he was just living the life there, and he was so glad that he wasn't back in America where all this stuff was going on. But then he saw that photo of Dot, the people behind her doing all the ugly stuff, shaming her. Here's what he wrote. There was an unutterable pride, tension, and anguish in that girl's face. It made me furious and filled me with anger and pity. I felt ashamed. One of us should have been standing there with her. I knew I could no longer sit around in Paris. Everybody else was paying their dues. It was time I went home and paid mine. Somebody should have been standing there with her. Friends, here's where the Verger comes in. This is why I bothered to tell you about it. I showed up in Washington, and the Verger stood with me wherever I went, and I loved him for it. God asks us, we get this wrong every time. God thinks that, we think that what we're to do when things don't suit us in the world is we just steam coming out of our ears, and we're fuming. And maybe you find people who agree with you, and you steam together, and fume comes out of your ears, and it's just like, oh. Or you're happy with things that are actually harming other people. Whatever that is, what God asks the people of God to do, this is bipartisan, it isn't liberal, conservative, any of that. What God asks us to do is stand with those who are being shamed. If you're being shamed, God is with you, and God wants you not to be ashamed. Others in our world are being shamed for all kinds of reasons. And when we as the people of God see it, God asks us, stand with them. Just stand with them. This happens all the time. Something happens. I'm not brilliant about these things. There'll be an anti-Semitic incident in Charlotte, and I just take a few seconds, and I shoot a text to my rabbi friends. That's nothing. But they say to me, that just meant the world to me, that you thought about us and you were standing with us. It's not a political stand. It's a personal stand. We have a good friend here in town, runs the best bakery in Charlotte. He is himself an immigrant, and he knows a lot of immigrants. And I just text him periodically right now, and he just says, that just means I'm not advancing an opinion on anything. I just say, I know I'm thinking about you. He texts back and says, that just means the world to me. I know people in relationships, spouses being shamed by others. I can't fix that for them, but I can text and say, I'm thinking about you. I care about you. God asks us to be like that Verger, because the work of Christ is bipartisan, is that no one is shamed. Everyone is honored. And we honor people by something as simple as just standing with them. And for this, we give thanks to God. Amen.